and welcome to the Gauntlet Podcast. This is the Gauntlet community's monthly podcast where we look at the games that we played on the Gauntlet calendar and we talk with a guest about a topic. Sherry is joining me as my co-host here.
Hello.
And I didn't introduce myself, so my name is Lowell. Hello, I'm the Gauntlet Gaming Manager who's been on here for way too long. So there we go. But this episode, which is covering sessions in October, we are joined by Leah Sargent, who has been on before, and we're very grateful that she was able to come back on again. Thank you, Leah.
My pleasure.
In our first segment, what we're going to do is each of us is going to talk about the games we played in October, both off and on the Gauntlet, and then we're going to pick one of those to talk about in a little more detail and have a discussion about. So, Sherry, tell me, how was your October for gaming?
So far, it's been truly excellent. Stellar games so far. Off Gauntlet, I played Hearts of Wulin Supernatural, which is just dynamite. It's been rolling along for months now, and I can't wait for the next session, and I love looking back at all the old sessions. And we finally got our 7th Sea light hack D6 monster that you made going. Yeah, 7th Sea has been amazing. And then, because numbers are apparently my off-gauntlet thing, we also are playing 13th Age. It has been good. We've hit like a good mystery, and now we've got a boat race with our lives hanging in the balance. Yes, it will be good. And as always, Star Trek Express, which is a joy and a pleasure. On Gauntlet, it was really amazing too. Played Yokai Hunter Society, one shot of that. Well, I will be talking about that later because it was truly, truly amazing. Played Star Wars Saturdays, Teens in Space. Had a lovely time. Best players, best game, just comfy and wonderful. Another playtest of Refuge, which has been lovely and thoughtful and a very different pace of a game. Also, playtest of Blood Ties by Daryl, which is a game about witches, and it's a Hearts of Wulin and Brindlewood Bay hack, and it's super fun so far. Apocalypse Keys in playtest, it's wonderful. And here's another playtest, Academy of the Blade, which is one of the stretch goals for Hearts of Wulin. We are giving that a playtest as well to make sure all the pieces work together. And our last session was mind-bogglingly good. Really, when I say October has been amazing, off the charts amazing. So, really, really wonderful. So, today I kind of wanted to talk about Yokai Hunter Society, which is by Kima Gonzalez. It is a zine that was created as part of Goon Jam, one of the itch.io jams. So, it's a rules-light tabletop RPG about monster hunters in Meiji, Japan. The base system is styled on Tunnel Goons by Nate Treem. So it's OSR-ish, I guess. I never know whether to call those games OSR anymore. So sometimes they embrace that label and sometimes not. But it's a lightweight system with just enough to work out whether things go right or not. And mostly it's about generating really interesting situations as quickly as possible. That is the whole idea behind the Tunnel Goon system. So one of the things that you're dealing with in the game is that the yokai hunters have a secretive nature. There's not a lot of resources, and there's a lot of changes that are going on in society in that time. So there's just like a ton of material to mine for GMs and for the players. It is a really interesting time when the world around it is changing. And so looking back at those sort of old stories and ideas about what is monstrous in the world is a really good way to look at the changes in the world. The game itself is available on itch.io. We'll put the actual link to it in the game notes. It's got a lot of features to it, though. This game has gotten a lot of love from its creator. It has an online character generator. It comes in both screen-friendly PDFs and high-res PDFs. There are demo downloads. There are character sheet PDFs. And it looks like folks like it enough to be working on translations. So you want to check out the itch.io site for links to the current status of physical copies right now, because due to certain issues, mailing is not that great right now. Mm-hmm. For the game itself, you're just rolling 2d6, sometimes with advantage or disadvantage. That's based on your background or circumstances. And then you're going to add modifiers based on one of your 4 stats, which are courage, self-control, sharpness, and wisdom, and your equipment. And you have to beat a 10 to succeed, so that's pretty hard. And you have a curse die, a D8 that you can add to a given roll that will eat away at your curse resistance if you end up using it. If it rolls well, it's going to eat up your curse resistance. You have very modest hit points, and you definitely should not attempt to engage anything alone in this game.
It's a hard play. Like, you have to curry and husband your advantages and bring them together. And I was a little nervous about that at the start. But yeah, it's a hard game.
It's a hard game if you try to do everything by yourself.
Mm-hmm.
It is a game that goes, no, you have other people with you, and if you aren't working with them, why are you even doing this? Is very much how it felt.
So not that different than life, then, this game.
No, exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. But sometimes gamers aren't always in that mode, you know? Yeah, but it like really feels that way. And it takes you exactly one roll to figure out you need to be doing that. So it routes you right into, okay, I better take this a little bit careful here. I think, though, that when you get those things all together, you can succeed, or at least continue to keep on trying. If you work together and you figure that out fast, the system's easy, the other players, their systems work easily with what you're doing, so it's pretty seamless. There are a few things that really worked for me. For instance, random character generation is fun. You end up with combinations of qualities that you might not have ever put together yourself in a given list. You're playing with 2 to 4 other folks who are in the same situation, so it ends up being kind of a really fun puzzle to figure out how to play together, interact, use what advantages you do have, what items you ended up with, and essentially how to deal with those things and the situation. So very good. The Tunnel Goon system itself, or perhaps this variation of it, has that significant disability, so help from another character gives advantage. And that one thing makes such a big difference. The group is always working out how can they help another person, and then making like good storytelling from that. So it ended up being a ton of fun. I love squeezing that use out of minimal circumstances, out of not having much to go on. The item economy is very light. Dang, is it open to good creative use. And it's one of those defining qualities of the starting characters that ends up delighting you later, because you start out with a rice roll and and you're so grateful for it later on when it gives you that little nudge that you need in a situation. So, it's just a very, very funny, down to earth, kind of charming game without it being twee or anything like that. I got to play with new Gauntlet folks, and that is always lovely. I'm rarely disappointed when I'm playing with Gauntlet folks. As is usual with Gauntlet folks, I was delighted. I got to meet and play with Dono and Abe Lincoln Jr., and of course, also to play again with my old pal Puckett. So that was good times. That will always work for me. Just get the gang together and go. And the scenario that we played had a little bit of pathos in it, a little bit of horror, and there we ended up with a good fist fight and a very difficult and satisfying fight with a vengeful ghost. And also there were gored yokai, and so that's sort of a lovely whimsical bit that will stay forever in my heart. So super enjoyed that. What I'm less sure about is that as a player, this is 100% what I wanted. There are enough mechanics for improving, equipping, healing, all those things that you would want if you wanted to play a series and have a great time. Though we played it as a one shot, it was easy to see how you could keep on going. The support for the GM is that sort of classic OSR tradition of tables of rollable story element seeds. So I guess it still means that the GM is the one carrying all the genre and the mystery luggage. I'm kind of selfish. I'm fine with that as a player. If I were a GM, I would really want to be, super comfortable with the genre of mysteries and maybe negotiating that Malu, that Meiji Japan. So you would be down a rabbit hole of internet research. I mean, it's just what you're going to do. The book gives you a sampling of yokai. There's a little bit in there about the Meiji era to get players and the GM a sense of how things should look. There's a very clean, you and your players are going to decide how closely the table itself tries to hew to authenticity of the era and the tradition of yokai. It's just straight up, like it goes, you're going to be handling this. Here are some of the elements to consider. And a bit of internet research and a cat's conversation, those things both are going to happen. probably, to get a game where everyone's on the right level of how supernatural and how gonzo or how carefully you're hewing to history or anything like that. Internet research for sure. I could just see rabbit holes down the line with this because it's a lot of fun stuff. I mean, the yokai are, and the Meiji era is fascinating.
There is some interesting resources out there. Certainly, there's Rurouni Kenshin, the anime and manga, which has had a long life, is set in Meiji era and really deals with those issues. And there are some other anime and manga that also cover it. But it is a period with a lot of really interesting change. Leah, questions, comments?
I do think it's kind of really interesting, the level of dependence you have on other people. I think that's the thing I'm most interested in. And I kind of wonder what's the minimum number of people you think you could run this game with.
I would almost want to have 3.
Yeah, I think 3 would be the best.
Yeah, 2 would be exhausting. You would exhaust your resources far too quickly. 3 minimum. 4 felt really good.
Yeah.
So
I think 3 could handle it pretty safely, too.
Exactly. Unless you were tossing funds around, and then you might be able to keep things going. But no, I would say 3 or 4. But you also want it so that you have different interesting combinations of people working together. That was a big part of it. Your characters that you get are very strange, with a kind of background that you're not expecting. The group leader was an accountant, a very good accountant. And and my character was a factory worker, but this was what they did on the side because they were part of the secret society. Another person was a Shinto priest, I think. Yes?
Yeah, a Shinto priest.
Shinto, sorry.
Okay,
Shinto priest, yeah.
But then I have to ask, for the accountant, was that their day job, or were they bringing the skills of accountancy to hunting?
Well, this is the thing, is we brought them.
Both.
Yeah, both. That's their day job. And then when we got there, we were like, oh, well, of course, there's all this progress that's going on. They're building roads and they're putting in new offices and they have technology coming in and stuff. So we posed as sort of surveyors and inspectors. So I, as a factory worker, I knew, essentially what those things look like, that technology. So I was backing up the accountant, and that's how we presented ourselves. And then the Shinto priest came in as the Shinto priest, and the other person who was actually a smuggler, that was their background, they came in as a tinker. And we all kind of scoped the village out and then figured out where the strangeness was, headed there. And yeah, and then the 4 of us, that strange group, we've managed to fight those things off. It was really charming.
And to mention for synergy for listeners, the scenario that I ran for that is actually up on the Gauntlet blog. You can check that out.
Oh, excellent. And I could think more scenarios would only be good. But my takeaway from it is I love good monster hunting stories. I think they cast a light on the world and the hunters, and on the nature of monstrousness and otherness and what we fear. So the setting this game in a time of huge changes creates a sort of interesting sympathy between the restlessness of the yokai and a population whose lives are changing so fast. And that scenario was particularly good for that, but it was a game that felt like those set of themes would really be a fertile place for those themes, and I love those themes.
Awesome. So, Leah, tell us how your October was.
Well, in some ways, it was a very light October for gaming for me, and in some ways, a very heavy October. It was relatively light on RPGs for me this month. I played Back Again from the Broken Land on the Gauntlet, which was my inaugural time running the game that I co-wrote with Alexi Sargent of Cloven Pine Games. And then beyond that, I went to Magpie's Design Day, which was a big time for playtesting and PBTA-inspired games. And I got to, test run in a very short run an Indiana Jones-themed game, Tales to Astonish, which is the kind of game that opens with, you're on a plane and it's crashing.
Yeah.
So that was a lot of fun. And I also really enjoyed Metatopia, where I got to go to a really cool panel on design for one-page games, where my core takeaway was that you need to know just the whole starting scenario kind of for that kind of game. You don't want too broad a world, but you're robbing the train to hell, you're trying to escape from this dungeon, but something nice and constrained. So that was all a lot of fun, but that was the full extent of my RPGs for the month. And all the rest of the games I played were more like, if I pick up this piece of food, will my baby try eating it this time? Or does she plan to throw it again? So a lot of games of that type. Games of chance, skill, hard to say.
Now, I have to ask, because you've been a designer for a while, Is this your first time at Metatopia?
It is.
Had you gone to the physical? Okay.
So I've never gone to the physical one. I was looking forward to doing it possibly this year. Alexi's gone in the past, and it's often scheduled against DoxaCon, which is tough for me since I love going to DoxaCon, a big con of Christians who are interested in sci-fi, fantasy, and gaming. So it's tricky scheduling, but this year both were virtual, so I went to both.
Ooh, nice.
Nice. So what are you going to talk about?
Well, so I am going to talk about my single on-gauntlet game, which was Back Again from the Broken Land. I'm going to drill a little more into my guest segment on some of the mechanics. But just to say a little, it's a game about small people walking home from a big war. It's very inspired by Tolkien, both Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. It's possible it's inspired by the Silmarillion, but I haven't read it, so I can't say one way or the other. But that sense of smallness, that you played a small role in this big story, and that the process of going home is as much a journey that has to be carefully navigated as the process of saving the world. So the core part of the story is that you're naming and hopefully setting down the burdens that you've kind of accumulated over the course of your adventures. Now, what worked for me, it was my first time GMing it, so I'd played it only once before, since between when we'd written it and when it, hit Codex. So I was just pretty excited to see what the players did. And it's a game where the players really do a lot of authoring of the fiction. The core mechanic is telling stories, fleshing out the whole scope of the world. There's just a couple pick lists at the beginning to decide what's going on beyond that. And there were just really wonderful moments. So one of the playbooks, the Wayfinder, is someone who's able to talk to animals. And I thought I'd really set stuff up for her by saying, like, okay, and there's these greater crows at the battlefield, and you're under threat by them. What do you do? And like, well, I definitely cannot talk to them. They're too far from nature for my power to be relevant. And it's just an amazing piece of player-authored fiction there. Normally, if someone's reluctant to use a move, I'm like, oh, did I write it badly? Is it not fun to roll? But just the choice not to use it made a big choice about what was going on in the world. And I loved those kind of surprising moments. Now, what I'm less sure about, we have those choice lists to decide what's going on, and because this story starts after the Doomslord has been defeated, anything that touches on that is going to happen in the pick lists or, in flashback as people are kind of tracing out what led them here. And people picked fun details about this Doomslord endangering the fabric of reality, who needed their true name to be brought to someone with the wisdom to use it. But for the most part, I felt these things never came up again in the story. I kept them in mind a little bit as a motif, so we had a spectral deer that needed to be called by its true name to escape from a piece of the land that held it. So I was trying to play up some of these themes, but I felt like, everyone enjoyed picking them and they didn't come up later. So that kind of leaves me wondering, what can I do as a GM to make that more inviting or more salient? But also, is this, a missed opportunity, or is it in some ways a strength that the journey itself was compelling enough that people didn't want to tell as many stories of the Doomslord, so much as stories of smaller choices they made on the way there, of a fight they provoked, or of someone they walked away from in a smaller moment. But I want to run it again and have other people run it for me and see what happens. Oh, a thing I know did not work as well is there were too few burdens. My players rolled pretty well, but I think it needs to be possibly more starting burdens, or possibly more of the GM giving people burdens more often on moves explicitly, because people just cleared them pretty effectively. And I've heard folks, I ran this as a one-shot with only a couple of the places you could visit, but I've heard folks running it as a 2 or a 3-shot, and the more time you have, the more of those burdens are going to be cleared by the end. And I don't want this to be a game where you can expect to work through them all.
Okay.
And the players asked afterwards, when I asked for feedback and stars and wishes, if there could be a help move, which did seem like a fairly natural ask, especially as it's a game about a little fellowship traveling together. So that's something Alexi and I are keeping in mind for a second edition. Though again, that kind of makes me wonder if I'm also adding a help move, what needs to happen to make things difficult so that it's not too easy to help each other out or to navigate all these burdens. Because the big tonal thing I always want to be true is these people are much smaller than the world they're traversing. Everywhere they go, and we tried to play this up in details, they're sitting with their feet dangling off the floor, they're all able to hide under one big shield, but they're away from home, and everything is harder for them to navigate than anyone else. So I want to make sure whatever level of help they can give each other, it doesn't make problems trivial.
I know you're going to talk about mechanics in the middle segment, but I have to ask, what for you was the genesis of this idea for this game? Because it's really, really distinctive. We've seen some games that talk about journeys, and we've seen some games that are kind of aftermath games, like I'm thinking of Before the Storm and some other ones, but this is a really unique idea.
Alexi and I both kind of frustrating that stories often end right after the climax. For me, I find this actually most annoying in romantic comedies and other stories where you have this whole dramatic getting together and it's like, well, they're kissing, they're getting married, it's all settled now. And the more you get to know the characters, the more you want to know how they grow into these new roles. And as a married person myself, I'm very offended by the idea that marriage is boring and there aren't interesting stories to tell at that point.
It's true, there's a lot of negotiations.
Yep. But it's also that with all these stories about saving the world, I love the Scouring of the Shire.
Mm-hmm.
I'm mad it wasn't in the movie because it talks about how you have to continue to do work to bind up wounds, that you can stop a Doomslord from continuing to endanger the world. But it takes real continued work and sacrifice to heal what's already been damaged.
Mm.
And I'll not put on a fully political hat here, but I think this is often the kind of work I'm really interested in terms of activism and politics.
Mm-hmm.
The slow, quiet work of rebuilding or strengthening things, not just the work of like winning one big climactic victory.
That's really interesting. And I should mention, in another bit of synergy, this game is available in Codex, which is currently in the Patreon feed as we're recording, and it has lovely illustrations in it. It really looks beautiful.
Oh, yeah, we were thrilled. We emailed them to our families.
All right, well, I'm going to talk about my October. Off Gauntlet, Hearts of Wulin, 7th Sea D6, 13th Age, Star Trek Express, all things Sherry mentioned. And then on Gauntlet for GCOG, for our Gauntlet Community Open Gaming, I ran Masks in Brindlewood Bay as one-shots, which were super good. Like, really had a great time. And the Masks one-shot was really good for me because it hit all of the elements of the system. Like, it was a really good demo game in some ways because all of the elements came out. I also got a chance to play Mork Borg, and I played a game called Tears of a Machine SC. And then outside of GCOG, ran Yokai Hunter Society, played Fate of Cthulhu, which I mentioned last time, Brindlewood Bay, The Pack I played with Dan Brown, and then I also played Shattered City. I'm going to talk about that. If you've listened to the podcast for a while, you've probably heard me talk about Legacy, Life Among Ruins, and these games before. Shattered City is a mixed-scale PBTA game built on the Legacy engine. You are factions in a city which was devastated by one empire, and you kind of build some of the history of that. And then a second empire came in, pushing back the first empire, and now they're in charge. And you're trying to grow your own power in your faction while dealing with the threats that are facing the city and the fact that you have these overlords in some ways. One player can play the overlords if you want, but usually would fall to the GM. Like other Legacy games, you play a faction and a character from the faction, but whereas most of the other games are very much about world building, even Free from the Yoke, it's theme feel rather than really defining the world and the premises. This one has a lot of framework and backstory. And so it doesn't take the same generational approach that Core Legacy does as shorter spans of time. And it's based on an Italian board game IP originally called Metatopia. I type it so many different ways. It's not a property I'm familiar with, but they kind of built on it. They changed the name of the RPG to Shattered City to make it a little more generally inviting. So there's a lot of pieces there. Now, before I go too much further, I want to stress that I love Legacy. It is absolutely... Core Legacy is one of my favorite games. I've run Core Legacy many times. I've run it with a fantasy reskin. I've run Free from the Yoke a couple of times. I really, really like that. That all clicks for me. Even when some of the players, it doesn't click for them, I love it and I love running it. So let me say what did work for me for Shattered City, because I'm sort of foreshadowing what I'm going to say in a moment here. It's a wild setting. It's got strange magics. It's got this, multiple peoples that are very, very different from being humans. It's got body-changing and world-changing effects of the magic. Even when you do magic well, there's a likelihood that it's going to cause bleed and problems. I always kind of like that theme. It does clean up some of the moves from earlier versions of Legacy. It's clear how to adjudicate some of the moves. It shifts some of the key moves, the things that are like info gathering, rather than being a roll and maybe you get something or maybe you fail and a bad thing happens, into, okay, you've got this resource, you spend it to get the information. That's good, because that's one of those weaknesses of the other games, is that I want to get information and then I don't get anything, and it causes more problems. And so this really works in this. The Session Zero stuff that they've got built for this is rich and dynamic, and you build a history of the empires before you get to the map and the player characters. You've got these cool choices. Whereas in a lot of the other earlier versions, sometimes you put things on the map, but you remember what you've said about them, but there's not a lot of weight attached to them. Here, there's a whole step where you go through and assign some weight and some value and some connections to them that enriches all of those. And it deepens the map phase, which I love, and makes it even better. It has a really interesting play structure with a kind of, at the start of a particular, I'll call it a season, you start by, okay, here's what the bad guy guilds are doing. And then the player characters of the venture talk about what they're doing. And then you kind of go into the higher level faction phase. You have a mechanic, a decree, that the GM says, okay, everybody gets one decree. And basically you can spend a decree to do any of the major actions for your faction. It's kind of neat. I love city games. I love every game that focuses on a city, on city building, on dealing with the aspects of the city. So this is all very much in my wheelhouse. All of that being said, this game is really complicated. It's really dense. I went into it, and at first I thought that this would be easier, and it kind of looked easier to me because of the changes they've made to the moves and how they cleaned up some things and how they made it easier to adjudicate things. But once you get into running, you realize how many additional systems they've added, how many other mechanics are going on, how many other dimensions to the characters, like the fact that the character level magic has a whole bunch of choices, and you have to make some choices about aspects of your magic at the start, and they combine and things. It was overwhelming. I don't say that easily, but it really, really did overwhelm me. And I'll talk about what the implications of that were in a second. The setting backstory is both rich and colorful, but it's also a barrier. You aren't necessarily held in place by the setting. You do get to define a lot. You get to build the map. You get to say a lot of things about the world. But there's also a lot of assumptions about, this is the way that magic works. This is the way these people interact. This is the way these empires are. That are assumptions that then as a GM you have to convey to the players, and the players have to work within. And it creates a certain level of uncertainty about whether, okay, does this fit? And maybe if it doesn't fit, it might actually be going against, when we go to the mechanical resolution, it might not work with that. So there's some issues that also add to the complexity. The cognitive load of this game is heavy. Like, for example, it has multiple currencies. You have lore, you have arts, you have decrees, you have influence. And in some cases, we found it very difficult to tell how those were generated and how they actually get used. And if they were particularly potent, how do we actually get them? And you'd have to really hunt through, because there wasn't a space in the book that said, if you want this, do this, these are the things, and here, giving us a good breakdown, where I've seen more of that more obviously in other versions of Legacy. One of the resources are these decrees. Decrees are actions. It seems like a good idea that, okay, well, I give everybody a thing you can spend to do a factional action, and everybody gets the same number. That theoretically seems good. But in practice, it led to an uneven number of turns, because one of the players realized how the economy worked and was able to get a little engine going to generate decrees, and other people weren't. So every time we went to a decree turn, one player was ending up with multiple actions and the other players weren't. I'm not a fan of asymmetrical numbers of turns in games, especially when it's mechanically imposed. So that was an issue. It's about the economy of knowledge. I'm sure there are ways around that, but because I didn't know and the players didn't know how to manage it, it got weirdly out of hand. The biggest problem is playing this from a PDF. I am absolutely certain that if I had this in the final printed version, if I had this in a hardback, that I could go through and mark up and annotate and flip from page to page, I would have significantly less issues with the game. I might not have any issues with the game, but the game is so dense and so opaque. Trying to read that on a PDF reader, Kindle, or even on the computer screen, I found it wildly threw me off. I wish I'd waited until I had the final physical version, because I do think that did a disservice to my play of the game. I'm planning on running it again, but I feel really mixed emotions about this because I love Legacy so much. To have not like a fully awesome experience. Thoughts, questions before I move on to my takeaway and continue to bash this game?
Well, so one question I have is just, amid all those currencies, did one or multiple of them feel like they were the most core to what the game was doing for you?
I think the one that actually, like, when you saw it, you're like, okay, this may be what play is about, is you've got this idea of influence, and a little bit like Urban Shadows in that sense, where one faction has influence over another, but then there's also that can shift to dominion, where you have you have influence over them and they don't have influence over you, and then you've kind of got some control over them, and then there's allies. And that's a really interesting dynamic. Like, I like that kind of triangle there, but it's kind of buried in there. I think the ideas of it are really core to what's going on, the faction politics. For example, it was hard for us to tell, okay, how do you actually get to this step, and what are the real implications mechanically once we've gotten somebody has dominion over another person? What does that mean? Well, how should they be playing their stuff then?
To me, this just sounds like the more complicated version of the problems that the original Legacy had. The engines that it had for its far fewer types of currency were still obscured and not made clear, and nor did all the clans have similar access to the parts of the engine, which could be an interesting thing, but it was absolutely dismaying if you didn't have that mechanical clarity to see the way through to get the stuff that you needed. And I think that the game clearly has a set of assumptions that's there maybe somewhere in the text, but it isn't there by the moves. It isn't there in the playbooks. It isn't there where the player is. And it takes page flipping no matter what version of Legacy you're in.
That's, for me, is the clearest thing, is it is not written with a clarity that moving through an electronic way, reading A to Z, or even jumping chapter to chapter, doesn't help. You have to be able to back and forth in a way that even hyperlinking I don't think would help.
Do you think this is something where a couple more one-page reference sheets will do it for players in GM?
Or a whiteboard. A whiteboard would be super helpful.
A whiteboard is a bigger ask.
Yeah.
I'm just picturing someone at a con rolling up and like, all right, well, here we are. I've just been dragging this
Here's
full-size classroom whiteboard around.
Cycle. Yes.
This is a 2-part session. The first part will be explaining the rules.
I have played games like that.
Oh, yeah.
Oi.
Oy.
Both board games and role-playing games.
I think that either a player-made or a company-made really good breakdown of the resources and how they work and which moves associate with them in a real, like a real annotation kind of, here's an additional thing. I think that would go a long way to helping out. And I may be able to easily generate that once I have the physical copy and I can look at it. So I had originally set this up to run for 8 sessions, but I literally hit session 4 and I asked for a mulligan. That's not something that I have done. I've only done that once before on the Gauntlet. I promised everybody that I would try it again later, but at that moment I just felt overwhelmed, especially because of the time of the year. You know, as we were heading into the election season, my anxiety level was already way high. That was just adding to it. I really do think it's a learning problem. When I sit down with a copy of the book, I have no doubt that I will get past that, and it'll still be a beast. I'm not saying it isn't going to be, but it will still be. The last thing I'm going to say, besides that I love Legacy overall, is all that being said, Patrick said this was his favorite Legacy game.
I knew you were going to say Patrick. Patrick always finds the little key to the engine. That is, Patrick!
Patrick really enjoyed it. Tyler liked it because he saw some of the mechanical bits, and he was the one who found the exploit early on. So all of that, my comments should be taken with a grain of salt. They were all nice enough to say, yes, Lowell, you don't have to run this anymore for us. So there we go. That's my October. Let's move to our second segment.
Hi listeners, Jason from Gauntlet Publishing here. I want to tell you about a couple of new things we have for you this month. The first is Nephews and Peril, a major expansion for Brindlewood Bay, the game of cozy murder mysteries and supernatural horror. Nephews and Peril is a collection of 6 new mysteries for the game, each by a different fabulous author, and some revised rules and gameplay advice. It can be found in the $6 plus Gauntlet Patreon feed until October 15th, and then Drive-Thru RPG after that. The next thing I want to tell you about is Codex Home, the first issue in Volume 5 of the magazine. Codex Home features new material for Trophy Gold and Brindlewood Bay, plus the all-new game Back Again from the Broken Land, which is about fantasy heroes recounting stories as they return home from a calamitous war against a Dark Lord, all while evading the remnants of that Dark Lord's army. It's a fantastic Powered by the Apocalypse game, and we're delighted to share it with you later in October. Remember, your contributions to the Gauntlet Patreon help support everything we do in the community, including this very podcast. As always, thanks so much for your support.
Listeners, for our second segment, we ask our guests to talk about something they're working on, something they're interested in, delve into an RPG topic. Leah, what do you want to talk about today?
I want to talk a little about customized conditions, particularly through the lens of the burdens in Back Again from the Broken Land. But because it's something I've encountered in a couple different RPGs, I like some of the possibilities they open up, but they're often a lot harder for people to navigate, especially their first time playing, or they can be a moment where a player stumbles and goes like, wait, I make this up? And like we were saying earlier about helping moves, I think they say something interesting about the world when you have like a list of conditions that are relevant to everyone or relevant to a particular playbook versus kind of much more made up and customizable ones. So to start, here's a little background on what we have going on in Back Again from the Broken Land. I'd say one of the core mechanics of the game is burdens. That at the beginning of the story, we have all these people, we're meeting them as the players really at this moment after the climax of their story as they start walking home. And each of them is carrying the weight of what they've done to get here. And of course, as players, we don't know because we haven't made it up yet. So initially, people start with a certain number of burden slots. So these are unnamed burdens. And you can kind of let that flavor your character that you're kind of carrying the weight of 3 burdens because you're the turncoat versus this other more stalwart character is only starting with 1. But the goal of the game is as you go to take opportunities to name the burdens and then to clear the burdens. And a burden can only be cleared once it's been named. So the idea is that in order to come home as much in one piece and ready for good growth as possible, you need to grapple with what's weighing on you well enough to give a name to it. A little bit of Wizard of Earthsea flavor really there.
Nice.
And then only once you've named it can you kind of confront it and make some kind of peace with it. And what the burdens do is they both kind of help you create the character as you go. They're flavoring the stories you tell and who you're creating, but they also kind of inflect what the end of the story is like for your character. Now, it's not a given that everyone makes it home. The PCs are still being hunted by some of the Doomslord's servants, so it's a little dicey to make it all back in one piece. But for everyone who makes it home, their epilogue is flavored by whether or how many unnamed burdens, named burdens they have. So everyone gets to tell a story of growth. But if you have a named burden you haven't relinquished, you have to also tell a story of amends, of something that remains to be done to heal. And if you have an unnamed burden that you never gave a name to, you have to tell a story of isolation. And we tried to connect these stories of growth, amends, isolation on our pick list. So you might have something like, for growth, a ruined field is replanted. For amends, a weed is pulled. And for isolation, a seed is parched and died. And these can all be as metaphorical as the players choose to make them. So it can be about just restoring a field in your village, or it can be about a seed of friendship that's extended and that you let die out of neglect. So burdens play a big role, but they're entirely player-authored. So when a player takes the opportunity to name a burden, which a couple of the moves give you the opportunity to do, including just a move that you can use any moment you have a little peace and quiet, You can gaze into the distance, describe what fragment of loveliness in the landscape has caught your eye, and then remember and name one of your burdens and describe how your outward behavior shifts as you remember it. But you can name it anything. So just in my last game alone, I have someone naming one of their burdens being a mother hen. Someone else had tantrum. Someone else had lack of confidence. It's been really interesting to hear people tell stories and then pause to decide, what about this story is my burden? You could have a story of kind of not returning a cloak pin that you meant to give to the father of someone you knew and fought besides who fell in battle. So if you didn't make the effort to keep your promise, is your burden broken promise? Is it cloak pin? Is it grief? I like how this keeps me in suspense as a GM and as a player when I hear other people doing theirs, of deciding what is it about this that's hardest for my character.
Now, you mentioned the idea of these customizable conditions being tied to particular playbooks. In Back from the Broken Land, I don't think that's what's necessarily going on, that different types have different conditions, right?
That's right. I think of the playbook-specific conditions as kind of being halfway between a game where everyone has the same conditions they might mark, and then games where playbooks all have different conditions available, which kind of makes a much bigger claim about what are the besetting challenges for each of these playbooks versus, in Masks, all teenagers struggle with anger and insecurity, etc. And then here, customized, you could have two people name a similar burden, or of course they could both be involved in the same story and take very different burdens out of it.
I like the idea of players, maybe if you could find a way where you have a few of those and players do get that ability to define what's a significant loss or condition to them.
Yeah, and I guess another inspiration, I didn't think of this explicitly at the time we were writing it, but is kind of Eugene Genlin's focusing technique, which is something more intended for therapy, but it's just the sense of probing a sense of unease you have and trying to offer it names. Oh, I'm feeling kind of unsettled because of this deadline. No, that's not it. You keep kind of trying to name what's troubling you until, at least Genlin's contention is that people will have this felt shift of suddenly, yes, that's it. That's the name for what's troubling me. And that part of what bothers us is this sense of being weighed down by things we can't quite look at, both because we're afraid of acknowledging how big they are and because the uncertainty we have about them and about their boundaries is part of what burdens us.
So do you find that the players struggle with how internal the burden is versus how external it is? Is that like one of their things that they're working through naming? Is it a personal fault? Is it a difficult situation? Those kinds of things.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think part of what put me in mind of Genlin is I feel like I've often seen people go through more than one name for their burden before they settle on it.
Mm-hmm.
And in almost all cases that I've seen so far, which as you'll recall, I've played this twice, people do pick an internal thing, that even if it's a discrete part of a story or one mistake they made, there's this fear that this mistake is part of who they are, or if they don't reckon with it, they'll do the same thing again in the future. I don't think I've seen anyone say, oh, it's this awkward tension I have with someone else, this kind of externally focused burden, so much as it's a sense of whether or not I'm a good friend to this person.
Mm-hmm.
One of the interesting things is this gets around one of the problems we've seen with games that have descriptor conditions. And now, again, we'll go back to Masks, Angler, Hopeless, or the case I'm thinking of particularly is Tales from the Loop, which has 4 conditions you can get, but sometimes when you get a condition, none of those fit. It's not actually what you're feeling, and you have to try to fit your emotions into the boxes that are given by the game that can feel really weird. It's especially restrictive in Tales from the Loop, and sometimes I've seen people, when they get a condition in Masks, I see them that moment where they go, maybe that's not what I'm feeling, kind of thing.
And it is always striking how, when you're talking about conditions, how people do respond to them for their characters, is that they are like, well, it's like this, but not. Yeah. So I can see how custom is good, but it's also got that problem of the world's wide open, right?
Yeah. Well, and it's freer to be customizable because all burdens weigh the same, basically, which I do like about it. One person's, I feel terrible at the one thing I said once when this person was nearly unconscious, so they probably didn't hear me, but I feel terrible. And I feel bad about the time I hid while someone else got stabbed in front of me and I didn't do anything to help them. They're the same, right? It's about how much it weighs on you. But with something like, masks or anything else, I think the real tricky part is if you don't feel like one of the conditions fits for you, or if you don't quite feel like it, you could give a name to something else, but you'd still have to decide what stat does this cut against.
Yeah.
And I think you could if you were just, your heart was so full and you're like, I don't feel like it's any of these 5. I'm willing to let it cut against this stat, but it cuts against it in this different way. As a GM, of course, I think I'd be fine with that. It would reflect the fiction, but that having to mechanize something where conditions all match particular stats would be quite hard.
Yeah. Passiones has the same problem. You get a minus to one stat and a bonus to another, but you only have 4 conditions and they're very, very evocative, but also kind of narrow in. And I've seen people grit their teeth trying to figure out how this actually fits with the moment they're in. I really like that idea of essentially you're defining your stress, I guess.
Yeah, your exhaustion almost as much as your stress, because it's the kind of thing you can go on carrying these burdens unnamed for a while. You've done it for a long time already when the game starts. So it's almost a question of whether you'll manage to get out of the rut, that healing is a question of starting something new and making a shift that will be uncomfortable for a little while because it means giving up something that's become attached to you. Part of the reason we had the name burdens, there's the obvious sense of them, but there's a moment in Pilgrim's Progress where Christian is traveling and people are invited to lay down their burdens at the foot of the cross. Pilgrim's Progress is a Christian allegory. But the longer you carry something, the more it may feel so much like part of you that giving up a burden that's crushing you is something you don't want to do anymore because you don't know how to walk upright unbowed by its weight, or you don't know exactly what you'll be like without it, which is why I use the word relinquish a lot in the game about what's going on, that there's a real sense of giving something up. And even when that's the right thing to do, it's still hard.
And that makes sense because as a player, and you're saying this is a thing about my character, then relinquishing it means giving up that part of that character that you've decided on and that you've got this rich inner sense of that character about, right?
This kind of suggests I should borrow a little from 10 Candles and make people write down their burdens and then hand them to me, and then I'll rip them up in front of them.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's not a bad
Wow.
idea. Yeah. Yeah, because there is that thing of, after a while, when you play a lot, you learn to love your character's flaws as much as you do their strengths. And yeah, I could see people being like, well, I guess it's time mechanically to do this.
Yeah. There's an interesting parallel I think that you're suggesting too, is one of the things is that not only are you kind of customizing the burden, you're also kind of customizing the way that you can heal. I mean, that's going to vary. You're defining that as well. It's not that process itself has a story beat to it, and the player gets to define that. That's really interesting.
And it can really vary. Something that you neglected to do might be something you heal by finally doing it, or it might be by forgiving yourself for leaving it undone.
Very, very cool. Anything else you want to say about that?
I'm just really excited to see how this works in practice. So if anyone's out there playing Back Again from the Broken Land, I'd be really interested to have you just send me the list of burdens everyone came up with in your game. I'm really curious about the range of examples and how much it's shaped by my being in the game and my own expectations for what they're going to be.
Awesome.
I like that.
Let's move on to our third segment. Listeners, for our third segment, each of us will talk briefly about something that has been inspiring us or giving us joy. So, Sherry, what is giving you life?
Oh my gosh, well, it is Ancient Detective. It is a Chinese drama. There's an English sub of it on YouTube, which is why I'm able to enjoy it. It is everything I've wanted in a ancient detective story, full of beautiful people in the world of Wulin, of Wushu. The detective himself has a tragic backstory of which he forgets what has happened on a battlefield where all of the heroes of the current Wuxia societies were killed, all of the heroes devastated, and he's the sole survivor, and he was a child at the time. He does not remember what actually happened, and he walks out of this and he cannot do martial arts. So he decides to become a detective. And then what happens is, of course, on the road, he meets a friend, someone who just immediately trusts him and wants to go along with him. And of course, he's handsome and perhaps not as clever as our detective friend, but earnest beyond belief. And then throughout their adventures, they meet beautiful assassin women that they fall in love with, because of course it's only assassin women that are available for falling in love with, apparently. And they solve closed room mysteries. The first story that they come into, it looks like they're gathering for a tournament, standard classic martial arts tournament, and then one of them gets murdered. And the detective has to solve the complete absolute closed room.
This
so
is the
good.
thing is,
so good.
The cycle is they go to a place, a bunch of characters come together, and you think, oh, it's going to be like a tournament or whatever, and then one of them gets murdered, and you realize it's an Agatha Christie cozy mystery.
Yes, it absolutely is.
And then they go to an island and a bunch of characters introduced and they're all martial artists, and then one of them gets killed.
Yes.
This is amazing.
I cannot tell you how wonderful it is. I just giggle the whole way through. It is everything my heart has wanted.
I love that kind of genre zigzag.
Yeah.
It's so well done. It's just wonderfully done.
Leah, what is giving you life?
It's the obvious. I've got a baby. She's just learning to walk. We gave her a little rattle shaped like a double-headed axe, so sometimes she'll pop up from behind furniture, like just a smiling little cheeping person waving an axe around. And when, things are safer, everyone should come visit us and game with us at our house. And she'll be bigger, but she'll still have the axe, and she'll only have grown stronger. But
Absolutely.
If people want an axe-themed thing that can give everyone life that I'm getting life from, it's Forged in Fire. It's on the History Channel. Like everything on the History Channel, it has only a tenuous connection to actual history. But it's a reality TV show about bladesmiths making blades.
Oh,
yeah.
It's so much fun. It's new people every week. It's mostly these, big dudes who are all really gracious losers who praise each other. So it's just this beautiful portrait of masculinity as well. But mostly it's people making knives, and then the knives being tested, and then people making even bigger weapons, and those being tested in a multiple target engagement scenario with giant fish. I love it. There's a lot of ballistics dummies getting disemboweled.
Phil Vecchione, the game designer, his dad won one of those reality show smithing shows a few years ago. So I love that stuff. Mine is not nearly as wholesome as any of that. Mine is Yakuza 7 Like a Dragon came out for the video game consoles. I've played a bunch of the other Yakuza games. They're dumb. This one is even dumber than usual because it's a Yakuza game. And you're never actually a Yakuza. You're kind of a fallen Yakuza. But it's crossed with Dragon Quest. So it's a turn-based, and it does all the Dragon Quest things about job classes and magic and stuff. It's really wild. But the thing that is amazing about it is the enemy at the start is capitalism. Really. And bad treatment of sex workers. And it's this weirdly enlightened game in some ways. And then you'll go another scene, and you're like, oh, yeah. But there's a lot of good stuff in it. And I do dig it in just the short time that I've played it so far. On that note, listeners, that is our show for this week. If you're digging this, you can check out the Gauntlet's whole network of podcasts. We have Plus One Forward, which is a PBTA podcast. We also have Fear of a Black Dragon, an OSR podcast, and we have more. You can find all of that at gauntlet-rpg.com. We also have a Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet that supports our podcasts. It supports our publication. It supports our gaming calendar. You can find out all about that if you go out and check that. If you want to talk to us about something, you can message us at Gauntlet RPG on Twitter. And if you're interested in playing with the Gauntlet online, you should check out our Gauntlet Gameway program, where we have a number of RSVPs set aside for marginalized gamers, women, person of color, LGBTQ gamers. Also, if anyone's suffering from financial hardship, we've got those set aside, and we'd like to get people to take advantage of that, especially designers that are out there and would like to come and play with a community that does solid indie and storytelling games. So keep that in mind. Again, more about that at gauntlet-rpg.com. Leah, thank you for coming on the program.
My pleasure. It's so much fun to talk with you, and it's even more fun to game with you.
Yeah. And Sherry, thank you for co-hosting again.
This is always a pleasure.
And that really is our show.